Peter Pan doesn't grow up. He doesn't establish a relationship with Wendy, who's actually real. He has to settle for Tinkerbell, who, you know, is a fairy, and they don't exist. And so she's really, in some sense, a figure of his imagination, because he won't mature. He can't have an actual relationship with a genuine person. So he has to satisfy himself with, well, it's something like a fantasy, actually. So seriously, it is like that. I mean, it's toned down a lot in the movie version, obviously, but still, that's what's underlying it. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't Peter Pan want to grow up? And the answer is, the only figure of authority that's around for him is Captain Hook. And he doesn't like Captain Hook, and that's because Captain Hook is a tyrant, he's brutal, you know, and he's also a coward, because he's lost a hand already to a crocodile with a clock in its stomach. That's chaos and time. You know, that's the dragon that lives underneath everything. It's like the basilisk in Harry Potter. And that damn crocodile's already got a piece of him, which is exactly the case. Like, that crocodile's got a piece of me. You know, I'm older than 50, and so time has already got its grip on me. And, you know, part of the problem of being adult is that you also have to take the fact that you're finite and limited into account. And if you're terrified by that, which people tend to be, then it can easily turn you into a tyrant. Because you're afraid of everything or disgusted by everything, and you have to ramp up the amount you control it. And so Peter Pan looks at Captain Hook and he thinks, there's no damn way that's what I want to end up as. So he's got a bad role model. You know, so Captain Hook and Stalin and this sort of devouring monster are good representations of the negative or tyrannical element of the Great Father. So that's the tyrannical element of the dominance hierarchy. Captain Hook, there at the bottom on the right-hand side, he's quite an interesting character, because he's basically a tyrant. And the Peter Pan story is very interesting, because Peter Pan sort of means everything. And Peter Pan is the sort of person who wants to retain the dynamic potential of childhood. Because when you're a child, you're not anything, but you could be anything. So you're pretty much only potential. And then you might say, well, why should you sacrifice that potential to become something actual? Because in some sense, it's actually a limiting process. So for example, and I mean this in the most concrete possible way, you have more neural connections when you're born than you do at any other time in your life. And most of those die by the time you're 2. So you go through this tremendous pruning process from when you're born till 2. So it's like you're dying into your childhood personality. And then again, the same thing happens at the end of adolescence, between, say, 16 and 20, which is also the peak time for risk for the emergence of schizophrenia. And some people think that's the pruning process gone wrong. But, you know, as an adolescent, you also shed childhood potential to become the limited but specialized and potentially useful thing that you will become. And so you might say, well, is it worth it? Is it worth shedding that potential? And Peter Pan's answer to that is, well, no. He wants to remain in Neverland as a magical boy forever. And he's king of the lost boys, which I would say is not that's not much of a dominance hierarchy, right? It's like you're the king of the losers, so to speak, people who can't get their act together and mature. Now, and you notice in Peter Pan, the individual is the hero in hero stories and is the initiate in initiatory routines. And so the hero is the person who is attempting to become a complete biological and historical entity, personality, so that they're capable not only of adopting independent existence, but of adopting independent existence that's productive, and that's productive in a way that's also of benefit to the community. So it's a particular pattern of development. And that needs to be catalyzed by human societies, because in order for a society to maintain its structure and for the people within it to thrive, the developing individuals have to mature to the point where they can take care of themselves in a way that doesn't disrupt the whole social structure. And so that's the path. It's a natural path for human beings, I would say, to some degree, because we're such intensely social creatures, but because we're also quite malleable and complex and also grounded in history and cultural creatures, it's also something that has to be taught both from the perspective of imitation and explicitly. And so a lot of initiation rites, for example, are predicated on the idea that you take the person out of their childhood context, you destroy their personality, usually as a consequence of some quasi-traumatic encounter, and then you refill them with the cultural norms, and that makes them an adult. And so, you know, to some degree that's what you guys are doing in a very slow way when you make the transition from high school, say, to university, or the transition from high school to a job. We don't, in our culture, we don't have the kind of abrupt ceremonies, though, that are designed to catalyze that transformation. And, you know, maybe that's an okay thing. And then maybe it's not an okay thing. I mean, one of the things that Freud pointed out, and he's absolutely right about this, is that because human beings have such a long dependency period, it's not that easy for us to grow up. And sometimes it takes a shock in order for that to happen. And so one of the potential problems with having a dependency period as long as the human dependency period is that it never ends, and that you stay immature forever. And really, I believe that that's the central Oedipal problem that Freud talked about, and I believe also that it's a real problem. Now, whether Freud formulated it, you know, with precise accuracy, that's a different story, but, you know, you got to give the guy a break. At least he formulated it, and it's, I mean, I was much more impressed with Freudian Oedipal theorizing after I did clinical work for a long time, because a large number of my patients, their primary problem is getting the hell out of their family. They just can't do it. And so for them, the world is the family. It's the only thing that matters. It's often parental opinion or something like that. They just cannot break free of it. So, you know, initiation ceremonies in part were designed to catalyze that break, so that your mother in particular, but also your father to some degree, were no longer the dominant figures of influence. Your personal mother and father were no longer the dominant figures of influence in your life. So, because really that's what maturation means in some sense, is that when you become an adult, the opinions of your parents are as important as the opinions of any other reasonable people that hypothetically care for you, but no more important than that. University is one of those patriarchal institutions that gives with one hand and takes away with another, right? So when you come here, there's thousands of you, there's tens of thousands of you. So in some sense, as an individual, you're rather faceless. And you're also, in some sense, at the bottom of the power hierarchy in the university. I think more than you should be, but whatever, you are at the bottom of it. And so there's a crushing institutional weight that comes along with being part of such a big university in particular, you know. That's really hard on students in their first year. You know, it's always seemed to me that it's better for first-year students to go to a smaller place where the institutional weight is not so heavy. And, you know, I've tested U of T students in their first year with things like the Beck Depression Inventory, and about 30% of U of T students meet criteria for hospitalized depression. They do, you know, but that's also because the Beck is way more sensitive to that than it should be, at least, that, you know, because I don't think its criteria for when you should be hospitalized are reasonable. But the point is that the depression and the anxiety is quite high. And so, but on the other hand, of course, you're benefiting from going to university. And so that's the kind of bipolar nature of the symbol. It's the tyrant and its benevolent tradition at the same time. You know, it's molding you. You could even say it's crushing you, because an educational system does that. But at the same time, it's like, well, unless you allow yourself to get crushed by it, you're not going to get the benefit. And that's the paradoxical relationship that individuals have with culture everywhere and at all time. You know, without culture, you're nothing, but with culture. You have to be a cog in some sense, and so the tension between those two things is continual and constant. You could think about it as an existential constant. Ever since there's been complex human societies, and maybe even when there were only tribal human societies, that's been a problem for the individual. So culture, tradition, the dominance hierarchy is a solution and a problem, and nature, the unknown, unexplored territory, is a solution and a problem. And then the third category, well, you see, I'll just tell you a couple of things about these images. So the one on the right, that's the devouring father that's also giving birth. So in some sense, your personalities are being devoured by the university, but at the same time, a new personality is coming, you know, emerging as a consequence of that, and hopefully it's a better personality than the previous one. If you can tolerate the tension of being transformed, the heat and the pressure, then hopefully you come out, you know, though it's worth it. The process is worth it.